everybody. Welcome to BIC Life Podcast, where we talk about life and faith in Jesus from a Brethren in Christ perspective. I'm Ryan Stockton, and I'm joined here as usual today by Scott McFeet.
Hey, how's it going, Ryan?
Hey, everybody. Good to see you, Scott, today. So this episode, it's funny, this episode is actually going to be dropping the first Monday of February. We always drop the first Monday of each month. So first Monday of February, and we're recording it on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And we didn't actually plan that intentionally, but it actually ends up being really appropriate given our subject of conversation for today, where we're talking about the Brethren in Christ response to the civil rights movement and some issues of racial justice in general. And to help us with this conversation is someone who has done some great work in this area, Dr. David Weaver-Zercher. Dr. Weaver-Zercher, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, for taking time on a day off at your place of work to have this conversation with us. Why don't you take a minute to just introduce yourself, tell us about what you do before we get into our subject for today.
Okay, well, thanks, Ryan and Scott. Thanks for having me on your podcast. Yeah, my name's David Weaver-Zercher. I'm a professor at Messiah University. My title is a professor of American religious history, and so I teach in the religion department. I teach courses primarily that revolve around church history, and particularly American religious history. A lot of my research and writing over the years has been related to Anabaptist life of various forms, often looking at plain communities like the Amish, but also some interest in other Anabaptist communities. I'm also the assistant provost at Messiah, so I'm a half-time faculty member, half-time administrator, and when I have the time, I like to do research and writing, and the thing we're talking about today would be my most recent published articles.
So when you have time, you like to do research. That's the operative phrase there, when you have time, I imagine.
Going into the archives and researching things can take a lot of time, and I've always enjoyed that. It's a little weird, you're reading people's mail often that they didn't know you were going to read, but that's part of the fun. And
wow. Yeah,
it takes a lot of time to write historically oriented articles because you're just looking for needles in haystacks and hoping you find some things.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's a movie that I really like, Andrew and I like. It's called Zero Effect. And it's Bill Pullman plays this really quirky, neurotic private detective. And he has this thing about searching. He's like, a quick note about searching for things. When you're looking for something, your chances of finding it are very small because of all the things in the world. You're only looking for one of them. It's like, but when you're looking for anything, your chances of finding it are really good because of all the things in the world. A lot of them could be applicable. So that just reminded me, like when you're saying going down to the archives and just looking for needles in haystacks, like I imagine that's what a lot of it is just looking for anything and just seeing what surfaces and being open to wherever the research takes you.
Well, that's exactly right. And sometimes you come across files or boxes and it's like, wow, this has been here all this time. And now, somebody's found it and there's something in there we're thinking about. So that's exactly right. And you can look for a long time and be disappointed, and then you find things and say, wow, that's it. I found something that's really going to help make sense of the past.
Eureka moments. So good.
Exactly.
So good. So so we've already kind of previewed the topic here, the history of the Brethren in Christ and how they interacted with the civil rights movement. That was the subject of your two most recent articles. And so, but before we get into some of that subject, what motivated you to get into this area of research? Why? For those who are watching this podcast, I know a lot of our listeners just listen to it, but if you're watching, you see Dr. David Weaver-Zercher, you see Dave here, and he's a white man in academia, but yet he is doing this great work in looking at the history of our denomination in the civil rights. So what motivated you? What made you say, you know what, this is history that we need to look at?
Yeah, I have a very specific answer to that. On April 4th, 2018, I was sitting in Hostetter Chapel here at Messiah University in a convocation oriented around commemorating the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. So that was April 4th, 2018. And, a number of people talked, a number of people shared their thoughts about the significance of that event. And it struck me as I was sitting there that my father, John Zercher, had just become the editor of the Evangelical Visitor about 6 months before that event. The Evangelical Visitor, that's now defunct, was for many years the Brethren in Christ periodical. During that time period, it came out every 2 weeks. And I knew my dad not only gathered articles from various people in the denomination and news, but also wrote editorials every time it came out, kind of, doing some sort of analysis of Brethren in Christ's life or analysis of some particular issue. And it struck me as I was sitting in this session, I wonder what those periodicals included. What did my dad include? Did he talk about it in his editorial? My dad died in 1979 when I was 18 years old. So I remember him being an editor of the Visitor. But, I was a teenager, just graduated from high school when he died. I didn't have a lot of deep conversations with him about what he was working on and what he was thinking about. So I was a little anxious, wondering and afraid I was going to go over and find nothing, that this had just gone past him on the radar and he hadn't acknowledged it at all. But what I found was a pretty intense, not super lengthy, but not super short either, kind of an intense editorial he wrote called Thoughts on Memphis, where he spent 3, 4, 5 paragraphs describing some of his thoughts. And I could tell that his thoughts were pretty frustrated with white Christians, and probably including white Brethren in Christ Christians at that time, who were very critical of King. And reading between the lines, I could tell that was the case. Many people criticize King and his sorts of efforts. And, my dad kind of took them to task. What do you expect him to do? What do you expect of African Americans who've been held down this long and are still being held down? Here we have someone, and he actually did compare his approach to Jesus' approach of nonviolence and trying to change things nonviolently. Said, here we have a Christian brother who's been doing this, working hard to overcome injustice nonviolently, and yet he seems at every turn to be criticized by white evangelicals. So I was pleased to find that, and I wondered whether what was going on there. Was he just unhappy with white evangelicals broadly, or was he frustrated with certain people in the Brethren in Christ Church that he was having these conversations with? Yeah. And so that sent me on a search of, what were the conversations going on during that time period? That was 1968. But I decided to cast a broader, cast my lens more broadly, and decided I'm going to start with evangelical visitors in 1950 and go up to 1975, 25 years, 2 issues a month for all those years. And they're in PDF format, so I could do word searches. So I started with, the first January issue in 1950 and put in Negro, African, race, racial. I mean, all the words that urban, civil rights, all these words, I was doing these word searches on, just looking
all the words that would have been
these,
used back in that time. Yeah.
All these articles. And, I wasn't sure how much I would find. I found a lot. And then I, worked with the archives to start getting into boxes of people that were talking about these things. And, I started not thinking I'd find much. In the end, I found a lot, and finally I had to say, I just got to stop. I got to write some things down. So that's the genesis, and that's kind of what I ended up doing, doing these pictures in the Evangelical Visitor, and then going into all kinds of boxes of committees and church leaders and things during this time period to find out what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, one of the things I found so fascinating with in your articles was how much conversation was happening in the denomination. There was a lot going on, and I guess it'd be kind of hard for there not to be that kind of conversation when it's such an issue, when it's an issue that's so in front of people, as it was during the civil rights movement of the '60s and early '70s. But it was. We'll get into this a little bit later. It was good to see all the conversation happening, but yet disheartening to see how some of that conversation went sometimes. But we can get into that a little bit later. So if it's even possible, can you give a kind of a synopsis of your articles? I mean, I've read these articles. They're combined almost 100 pages, and they're brilliantly researched and footnoted and thorough, and I really enjoy them. They're fascinating. It's fascinating work. So I don't want to do a disservice by saying, hey, can you sum up in 2 minutes all of this work? Yeah. But could you, in a span of a few minutes, kind of give some overall ideas regarding from your articles, things that you pulled out, takeaways, if you will?
Yeah, well, the first of the two articles has 2 words in the title: sympathy and disfavor. And I think that kind of summarizes both of the articles, that white Brethren in Christ people, and that's basically all Brethren in Christ people in North America in the 1950s and 60s, were sympathetic with African American aspirations, were cognizant of how African Americans had been oppressed, at least to some degree, were in sympathy with their aspirations for equality and fair treatment. But along with that, they expressed disfavor toward the civil rights movement and any sort of activist or politically oriented efforts to change that. So Brethren in Christ people were sympathetic to aspirations, but unsympathetic and actually expressing disfavor toward the civil rights movement, civil disobedience, etc. And, that fits right into Martin Luther King's critique of white moderates that comes up in his letter from Birmingham jail, where he actually says, these rabid racists are bad enough, but even worse is the white church that criticizes us for civil disobedience or activist or marches. So that's where, I found the Brethren in Christ, they fit solidly into King's critique of white moderates during that time. Although, history is more complicated than that. In the Brethren in Christ Church, you had people that were sympathetic with the civil rights movement. Those people were fewer and farther between, but some were quite articulate. Some people in the younger generation that was rising at that time were attracted to more activist elements of the civil rights movement. So I unpack this conversation that emerges between who I call the activists, who believe that, recognizing social problems and working in an activist way to change social structures was a way and a good way to respond to white supremacist America. The activists over against who I call the conversionists, who thought the answer to every social problem in America was just convert more people. And unfortunately for the Brethren in Christ Church, the conversionists thought the answer to the race problem was converting African Americans. That was their goal, or at least that's what became their primary method of responding to what they called the race problem. Which is a problematic phrase in and of itself. But we have the activists who did promote a more activist, would have been sympathetic with the civil rights movement, over against the conversionists who, again, at least said they were opposed to racism and white supremacy, but thought some conversionist approaches was what the church should do, excuse me, and the church should stay out of politics, should stay out of those sorts of things. So that's what I unpack, and the activists, they were always there, but they were in the minority, And, eventually I would say they gained a hearing, but they didn't gain ascendancy in terms of their views being affirmed.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I've got I've got so many questions through some of that here. One question, talking about the evangelical visitor. It was kind of during its time, the Evangelical Visitor, which is a publication that has come up a couple of times in our podcast so far. Scott, we had a good conversation with Dr. Devin Manzullo Thomas last month about some of the work in the Evangelical Visitors there. So it was kind of an open forum to some degree, right? There was a lot of people who could write in. There were a lot of opportunities for opinions and things like that. Those who took a lot of initiative and motivation to actually sit down and write and submit to the Evangelical Visitor. So I imagine it would just take a certain personality to write into the publication anyway. But were most of those writings, what was the content of most of the submissions to the Evangelical Visitor? Not necessarily the official words from the denomination, but from the people, right? The people of the denomination as they were writing in and stuff. What was the conversation? Kind of just what you're talking about, the white moderate. Hey, we sympathize, but let's keep law and order and things like that. Or was that where a lot of the activists were finding a foothold and a platform? Or how did that play out in the Evangelical Visitor?
Yeah, but that's a great question. The Evangelical Visitor, just to say a little bit more about that, it was kind of a smattering of things. I'll just talk about when my dad was editor, and this would have been true when John Hostetter was the editor before him. There were articles written by Brethren in Christ people, but a lot of the articles were articles written by outsiders that were maybe published elsewhere that they would pick up and republish. There were a lot of short news blurbs that they would pick up, often from the Evangelical Press Association. So these were news blurbs that the visitor editor would see in some venue and be able to republish. My dad did an editorial every time the visitor came out. John Hostetter didn't always do that. So in some ways, my dad's voice is more present in saying, this is why these articles are here. And sometimes he'd say, not everybody's going to agree with this article, but I think it's important for people to hear. Yeah. And one of the things that he did when he became editor 67 going forward was give voice to some of these people that were frustrated with a lack of activism. So, you hear those voices, but you hear other voices as well coming, say, from denominational leaders, from other evangelical voices that my father is picking up and republishing. In some ways, the Evangelical Visitor wasn't my best source in the end. I mean, you'll see that in these articles, they show up and they're footnoted, but they gave me leads as to where else I should be looking into the boxes of certain leaders or committees and conversations that were going on. Yeah. Now, having said that, my dad's editorials and some of the things that he had published were things that were really pushing the boundaries in the Brethren in Christ Church at that time. And I found those to be valuable to highlight that at least he was encouraging people to be thinking about these sorts of things.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. So these articles, these articles that you published, they haven't been out for all that long. When were they published? It was
the one came out a year ago, December, and the other one came out in April. So they basically in the last year they've occurred.
So have you received much feedback on this work? What's been the response that you've heard from just folks in the denomination or students? I don't know if you have any students who have read them or.
Yeah, I've gotten a good bit of feedback. Some of the feedback has been from colleagues and others here at Messiah who are glad to see this conversation about race localized. We're not just talking about all kinds of things that were happening out there. I'm talking about things that are happening in the Brethren in Christ Church among faculty who worked here at Messiah College at the time. So, I've gotten some appreciation. It's easy for colleges and universities to talk highly about themselves. And I think people feel like, this is actually doing the kind of history that ought to be done. And that is showing the complexity of things and sometimes showing that things weren't always the way we wish they would have been. So I've gotten some comments around here in that regard. I did run into an older gentleman who attends a Mennonite church, but worked here at Messiah for many years and said, I've been reading your articles, and I used some phrase about throwing the Brethren in Christ Church under the bus, and seemed to think that, I shouldn't be writing something that reflects negatively on the church. And he thought that maybe, this did, which, I think history often does not reflect the way we wish things would have been. So, I've gotten a variety of responses, most of them positive, but sometimes I think people think, I should just let sleeping dogs lie and not, stir up things. One of the responses I heard from someone else, and I don't know if it was so much a critique of my article, but of others, was, sometimes those of us living today expect people in the past to, somehow be more enlightened than what they are, that maybe, we ought to have more sympathy with people because they were people of their time. And, that conversation grew out of his reading my article. And I'm not sure if he was criticizing me or thought I did an okay job at that. But it's an interesting comment and an interesting thing to think about. But I always want to note when people say that, people were people of their time. I mean, as a historian, I want to say, yes, that is true. But even when we go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, we see different people taking different approaches, having different analyses and things. So to simply say, well, they were people of their time, I want to say, well, yeah, no, that's true. But some people, I think, had better ideas. They were doing better analysis. They were more realistic about the problems and the solutions than others. And so, some people, I'm sorry, they just got it wrong, even though they had the possibility of getting it right. I mean, other people were, in my view, getting it right. Yeah. So anyway, this article has opened some doors for me to think about that particular issue, about what it means to both be generous toward people in the past. I mean, I'm sure people will look at my life and say, man, I really screwed up. And I want to be generous toward people, but I also want to say, we need to be critical. We shouldn't just be totally relativistic and think that, just because people did it in the past, they're off the moral hook.
Right. I appreciate your point that anytime we look in the past, it's complex. There's not like one person's idea that like speaks for the whole group. However, I do have a question for you, and it comes from the very beginning of your first paper. It's a statement that like really stuck out to me, and I was hoping you could kind of unpack it for us.
Yeah.
So it says, the Brethren in Christ Church remained a largely silent observer of the most important social movement in the 20th century America. I mean, I think that's kind of what you were talking about, how sometimes the facts of history aren't what we would hope they were, but I'm not like, I'm not a history buff, so I'm kind of new to this. Like, I'm learning. I would love to hear you talk about that. How, in what ways were we, the Brethren in Christ denomination, largely silent, or is that just it is what it is? Like, we just really kind of ignored it.
Well, yeah, and what I would say is that most white Northern evangelical Christian churches were largely silent. When you look at people who were allies of Dr. King and others, Northern white evangelicals weren't the ones who were his allies. And I think, his letter from Birmingham jail is asking for those allies to be more vocal. So to say that the Brethren in Christ Church was mostly silent observer, I think in that sense, it fits well in the mainstream of white evangelicalism, white Northern evangelicalism, who, like the Brethren in Christ Church, I think were often appalled by what they saw happening in the South, but urged patience or thought, things will just work themselves out over time. And so, there were these two statements that the denomination made as a general conference, but, one was in 63, I think, and the other was in 64. Those are the only two denominational statements. And, the first one seems to be like the BIC are on board with things. And the second one is basically, doesn't even acknowledge Black grievances. It just says that good Christians aren't going to get involved in these, hysterical mass movements. So, and then the conversation to some degree goes away. Now, again, I found the conversation continuing, and we weren't totally silent. There were these conversations, and there was a group of activists that emerges and says we really need to recognize the continuing social problem here that whites created, and it's going to take white allies to help fix. But anyway, largely silent. King and his friends wouldn't have found a lot of allies in the Brethren in Christ Church.
Your the conversation that you had with the older gentleman saying, we shouldn't be dredging up, stuff that reflects poorly on us, throwing the Brethren in Christ under the bus, as it were. It leads well into one of the questions I had. So as people, not just as Brethren in Christ, not just as Christians, but as people, we want to believe the best about the institutions or the groups that we choose to affiliate with, right? The same is true for me with the Brethren in Christ denomination. I want to believe the best about us. And so as I'm reading these articles, I'm just like, oh, dang it. But why do you think people are resistant to critical analysis of institutions that they're a part of, and what do you think's at stake for them? Right. So why are people hesitant to admit that failures exist in their institutions that they are a part of?
Well, I'll try to answer that on a couple levels. I mean, the Brethren in Christ Church is an interesting institution in that, up until the last, I would say, 30 or 40 years, very family oriented. I mean, there's not, there's an emphasis on evangelism, but a lot of shared names, a lot of shared family history.
Yeah.
And so when you write Brethren in Christ history, and this is true of me, you're writing family history. And like I noted when I first got into this project, I was a little afraid to go over to the archives and look up and see what my dad said at that point. Now, I also talk about my grandfather, Henry Hostetter, which is on my mother's side. My mother's maiden name was Hostetter. Her father was Henry Hostetter. He was an executive in Brethren in Christ World Missions. And, when he steps down in 1968, he basically gives a talk to the General Conference and says, missions and evangelism is what we do. And he criticized these ministers that are spending a lot of time talking about social action and social activism. I mean, it's just a few months after King is assassinated, and he's in front of the General Conference criticizing these ministers that are working for social change, that they don't quite understand what their vocation is. So, even I'm writing this piece knowing that, okay, my dad looks pretty good, at least from where I stand. My dad looks pretty good. My grandfather, Henry Hostetter, who was a great grandfather, a wonderful grandfather in any way you could imagine. I almost like, I don't want to write this about my grandfather. He's a great guy. He's a warm-hearted guy. I mean, he's the kind that you'd say his heart was always in the right place, but man, I wish he wouldn't have stood up or sent in this report months after King was assassinated, criticizing ministers for being engaged in social activism. So that's part of it. Like, we sometimes in Brethren in Christ history writing, some of us are doing family history, and I'm criticizing people that were friends of my parents and my grandparents and things. As for criticizing our institution, I mean, I think you've landed on it. We don't devote our lives to institutions, but yeah, we sort of do. I mean, we are embedded in these institutions. I work for Messiah College. I take my paycheck from Messiah College. It pains me when other people criticize Messiah College, Messiah University, and I want to defend, this as being a good place, because if it's not a good place, what am I doing here? So I think you've landed on it. We are embedded in these institutions, and we want to think that, our lives are worthwhile. And how can they be worthwhile if we're spending our time working in a very flawed institution? Now, I think that's the answer to the question. I would note that, all institutions are flawed. We need to be honest about our histories. We need to be honest about our flaws. That's often easier said than done.
Yeah, like in a way, admitting of flaws in an institution that we're a part of is in some way acknowledging that we ourselves are flawed. Just because it, like you were saying, if Messiah isn't perfect or a good place, what am I doing here, right? Like it reflects on you and your choices and all this sort of thing. So yeah, to say that there were shortcomings in my family of origin, what does that say about me, or a family that I chose to affiliate with?
Right.
It gets personal real quick.
Yeah, it does.
But yeah, I think, I mean, even for like Scott and myself, we have not been a part of the Brethren in Christ for very long. Both of us are fairly new to the denomination, particularly when in comparison to others in the denomination. So our last names are new to the BIC now. So
yeah.
maybe our grandkids will have some of those family issues, maybe. But
well, and I think the moving beyond like a very tight knit, everybody's married to everybody else, or everybody's related to everybody else. I think that opens up possibilities for these conversations in a way that a very tight knit kind of family oriented denomination. And, again, all these things are relative. Even in the 70s and 80s, it was less that way than it was in the 1930s. But I think there's been a lot of change from the 70s and 80s to the present, in terms of, you don't need to have the right last name to be a bishop or to be, one of the key leaders. It was much more tight knit there. And, people are hesitant to see family members criticized.
Yeah. That's tough. Well, man, It sounds like it took some guts to put some stuff on paper and then send it out for just anyone to see.
We don't do that today, though. I mean, I'm joking. Facebook, Instagram,
Right,
you put
right.
whatever you want out there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's not usually heavily researched and footnoted.
That's true.
Yeah. And writing history is an interesting thing. I mean, there are boxes over in the Brethren in Christ archives right now that are, off limits. People decided to put things into the archives of family members that they thought was worth saving, whether it's diaries or letters or whatever. But there are, notes on them not to be opened until, 2030 or 2040. And that's pretty typical in archives, where people say this file should only be seen from this point on. It always makes me curious, like what's in that file. And people have different sensibility of what is really controversial or potentially explosive. But I wouldn't want anybody to go into my files right now and write about me. So, archives are an interesting place. There are things that are very private and closely held at the time, but they end up in archives, and then historians like me go in there and, I call it reading other people's mail. I go in there and read other people's mail, and I find certain things and fix on certain things that I've decided are important. And again, sometimes they reflect well on the writer, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
So anyway, history writing is an interesting thing. I think it's really valuable. I think it gives us a sense of truthfulness about our history, our institutions that would be lacking if we didn't do those sorts of things. But it's a fraught endeavor for sure.
Yeah. Well, okay, so kind of changing tack here. Scott, did you have something?
I just imagine Devin Manzullo just incognito, like at 2:00 in the morning, in the no one knows he's in there. He's rifling through these boxes that aren't supposed to be there. I'm sure he's not doing that, but that's what I'm picturing.
It's fun to imagine that, isn't it? With the flashlight on his phone.
That's right.
Around.
Yeah. Add a little like spy music in the background, and
that is a nice image. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sure he will too.
Oh yeah. Oh man. All right. So I had a question. So about in one of your articles, I can't remember which one. I think it might have been the second one, Words Empty and Hollow, where you're talking about Paul Hill on page 33 of your second article, talked about how the race problem in America, and you touched on this before, was not about systemic white racism over decades, but rather a spiritual matter that should be resolved through faithful evangelism. And this was quoting this guy, but it was not just him. This was a representative, really, of a broader perspective, not just within the Brethren in Christ, but as you say, in the broader Northern evangelical white church. And there's this false. This creation of this false dichotomy between social activism versus spiritual activism, this spiritual versus social, and we see it's still thrown around today. Like, it is still what we see today, and it seems really attractive to have this like a false binary or something when it comes to race. In particular, I see it a lot with race, but it's in other areas as well. Why do you think it's such an attractive way to think about things in this very black and white, either or, one or the other, and why are people so hesitant to embrace kind of a both and or a multifaceted approach to things for human crises or issues that are going on?
Yeah. Well, let me back up and say a little bit about Paul Hill's article. That was one of, I think, 4 or 5 articles that appeared in the Evangelical Visitor. My father devoted an issue to, I think the title of the issue was "The Urban Crisis." So this was in the summer of 1968, a few months after King's assassination, when there were many urban uprisings, looting, building burnings, buildings that are being burnt, and actually our own Chicago mission was a victim of an urban uprising, or at least part of that. And so, my dad is getting these articles together, and he has African American pastor, Mennonite pastor in Chicago, Curtis Burrell, write a piece that is extraordinarily hard hitting toward, how can you not expect this urban uprising given the violence that African Americans have suffered all these centuries, and now you have the audacity to critique them for these uprisings. That's the very hard-hitting piece on the one side. And then my dad invites Paul Hill to write as well. And in some ways, it's a sensible choice because Paul Hill has been a Brethren in Christ pastor in an urban setting, New York City, for a number of years. So, he's inviting Paul Hill, one of our few urban pastors, of course, white, pastor, write about the solution to these urban uprisings, and his article basically talks about evangelizing African Americans, and if only they would be converted, they wouldn't be so interested in pursuing what he puts in scare quotes their rights. So there's a lot of not very attractive things in that piece. But having said that, he's on exactly the same page as my grandfather, who I talked about earlier, that thinks the solution not only for eternity, but for a better earth is to evangelize people and save their souls. And there's something, I think, attractive about that in the Brethren in Christ Church in particular, because it doesn't take a lot of sophisticated social analysis about what is the solution. It's like, this is a tool that we know the church has used for centuries, evangelization, and at least there's a kind of a theological stream in the Brethren in Christ Church that if we just get people to, pray the right prayer and give their life to Jesus, they will have the right perspective on everything, including race and racism. And I would say that's simplistic. Michael Emerson and Christian Smith, who wrote a book a number of years ago about evangelicals and race, looking more at the early 20th century, they call that the miracle motif. And it's not a positive term in there, to call something the miracle motif. You just convert people, everything else will turn out right. And as Ron Sider, one of my other activist actors in my article, notes, there's a lot of historical evidence that that's not the case. The southern states have always been the most Christian states, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, etc. Right. They looked north and thought, the North is too religiously pluralistic. There's not enough conversion in the North, etc. They were very proud owners of the evangelistic, revivalistic tradition. Everybody in these southern towns was a white evangelical Christian. So the argument is that simply getting people to, whatever language we use, give their lives to Jesus at a revival meeting, that doesn't make things turn out right. Now, again, Paul Hill's article is even more problematic because the problem is not white racism in his view, which you'd think in his view would mean converting white people. No, the problem was African Americans that had this violent bent, and he even uses the word demonism, and they were the ones that needed to be converted, and then these urban tensions would disappear. But again, your question is, why is that so attractive? Well, my sense is it's a tool or an activity that Brethren in Christ had long been comfortable with and had long used. And it doesn't require of people kind of sophisticated sociological analysis and kind of long-term commitments to deep problems. It's hold a revival meeting and get some conversions, and things will be turning around.
It's pretty costly to think the other way around. I've been a part of myself for a while and do some work in the recovery community, and I'm a part of Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christian based program based on the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the biggest thing about it is that our higher power is Jesus. It is the God of the Scriptures, and that kind of sets it apart from other 12-step related programs. And so one of the biggest things early on in your process is claiming Jesus as your higher power. That is coming to know God, that's your coming to Jesus moment, right? That is your conversion. That's the conversion. But there is work, so much work after that moment.
Yeah.
And I find that in that space, in the recovery space, it makes perfect sense that once you come to Jesus, you still have your addictions. You still have, some people are miraculously delivered and that's there. But even for them, there is work that needs to happen because there has been fallout from previous behaviors and actions. And so there's amends that need to be made. There are relationships that need to be restored. Even if the addiction is somehow miraculously fixed, there is still tons of work to be done. And I find that a lot of Christians, some Christians are just like skeptical of the whole recovery thing. But in general, Christians seem okay with that idea. That, okay, once you come to Jesus, there's still work that you need to do to change habits, to, all this kind of stuff. But this dichotomy of just once people become saved, then the race problem, as it was referred to back then, the issue of racial injustice or whatever, will go away once people become Christians. But it doesn't seem to make, in practicality, as we see in recovery, as we see in so many other areas, coming to Jesus, yes, that is our most important need. As Jesus was healing the man brought down from the roof, he forgives his sins because that's his biggest need, but he also heals his leg, right? Coming to Jesus is our biggest need, but there's still so much work that needs to be done. So it sounds really good. It sounds really spiritual to say if we just evangelize better, but there seems to be,
And it's even more complicated. I mean, you're talking about dealing with an individual who comes and wants to recover from this addiction. But, here we're talking about a society that has, had this sickness and affliction of white supremacy. So you can't just snap your fingers in 1968 and eliminate all the historical outplaying of this white supremacy.
Right.
And that's where, you talk about it's more costly. I mean, it's costly in terms of sociological analysis and planning ministries, but it's also costly in that, from the 1960s on, there's been a call for, I'm going to use the word reparations, in a sense that the society as a whole needs to do something to reverse the effects of, 250 years of white supremacy. And, that becomes very costly. And, churches can't do that on their own. We're asked, there's a call for the entire nation to take this on. But it's just so easy for people to say, well, I'm not willing to pay that cost. I didn't own a slave. I've always treated, Black people well, and I've interacted with them. So it's even more complicated when it's not just an individual who is diseased in some point. This is a society. The solutions often begin to sound very, very costly. I just wanted to read something, the last paragraph of my second piece, where I talk about, kind of where the Brethren in Christ land, in the late 70s and 1980. where the activists have kind of said their piece, and now the BIC church is kind of reverting to the mean. I say where starting churches, sending missionaries, and saving souls would continue to be the church's primary goal and primary approach to things. Said those things, starting churches and saving souls, didn't need to be antithetical to anti-racist work, but in a world of limited resources and limited imaginations, the world we're talking about race was always more unsettling to white people than reassuring to them. Those things often were set at odds with one another. And I do want to emphasize limited resources and limited imagination. I mean, Brethren in Christ church leaders were very busy, overworked people, usually men, busy, overworked people before the issue of race began getting attention in the 1960s and 1970s. The Brethren in Christ denominational budget was already maxed out. So, the resources are limited, but I also say the imaginations are limited. And what I mean by that is that, well, in my imagination, saving souls is going to solve all the problems. I would say that's a limited imagination. So, right. Limited resources, limited imagination, those things are often set against one another rather than taken up as a whole. Evangelism has its place, but so does kind of hardworking social activism to change social structures that are robbing people of dignity. That's a different thing. Ideally, the church would do both. It's hard to sustain them both, I think.
I'm so glad you brought that up and read that, because I have that same quote here I was going to use to kind of move into my next question, which you pretty much already touched on. So, your articles, you stop short of prescribing any way forward, which as an historian and given the scope of your work, that is not what you are trying to do there. And as an historian, I understand you can be very careful about trying to prescribe any ways forward. So I understand that. But that phrase, the limited resources and limited imaginations, that really struck me because it just seemed like, all right, well, what are some ways forward? And I feel like this releasing of our imaginations to say, what are some, all right, maybe we don't have a lot of time. Maybe we don't have a lot of financial resources. Maybe we don't have a ton of people in our congregations, whatever it is. How can we get creative in engaging these conversations and engaging our communities in ways that can help those who are disadvantaged and disenfranchised, and also in ways that grow me and us in humble education as we learn more and more about the history of how we got here. How did we even get here? So these kinds of articles are so important. I don't know if you want to go here, but do you see any good ways to move forward, or perhaps identify approaches that have been tried in history that have proven not to be good ways forward? Would you like to speak to that in any way here?
Well, I have a couple thoughts. I mean, when you talk about ways forward or solutions, I mean, it'll be different if I'm talking about a denomination, this association of churches, or if I'm talking about a local church that maybe is located, and I'm going to pick on Scott here in Refton.
That's fair. Yeah,
Lancaster County. Yeah. I mean, it's a very different place than the Harrisburg Brethren in Christ Church or right. Something like that. So, I think denominationally, I mean, I don't want to be too prescriptive, but I would hope all denominations would have room and make space for conversations about race and race in America and continued disparities that exist because of race. I would hope denominations would at least have that conversation where they're resourcing pastors to at least think intelligently about the problem of race in America. Pastors are going to take that back to their churches and do different things with it. But I would hope that a denomination would not say those conversations are too hard or too potentially divisive. And I'm really glad a couple weeks from now I'm going to be doing a theological study forum that hopefully will engage pastors, and I'm glad you guys are doing what you're doing. As far as local congregations, I mean, we have an interesting project going here at Messiah called Thriving Congregations, where we got some money to pull together leaders from a variety of congregations in this area, both in the Harrisburg East Shore and near Messiah here on the west shore of the Susquehanna River, predominantly African-American congregations, predominantly white congregations. And what we're asking all of those congregations to do is, well, first of all, the leaders are reading some books about race and racism in America, but also then to do some historical exploration about their own church, and or at least their own region where they're embedded. And there are good resources, there are good histories out there. I don't think local congregations have a very good sense of where they fit in this story of race in American life. And, even if you're a rural Lancaster County church or a rural Pennsylvania church somewhere, there's a story about race in your county and in your community, about who was welcome to be there and who was told sometimes in threatening ways that you're not welcome. Talk about in the north, sundown towns. Camp Hill, 5 miles north of us here, is even today a white, largely white, quite wealthy community. Well, it was a sundown town. If you were African American, you didn't want to be in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania after sundown. So all of these local communities where we're embedded have a history of race that have shaped who we are today. And I think that's at least one thing that local congregations can do, although, I realize it's hard being pastors and hard having conversations like that. But I would hope that would be something that some courageous BIC pastors would do, to be asking those questions about their own communities, and maybe how their own church operated in those regards. One of the things that happened in the 1960s when these things were happening is they found a number of Brethren in Christ churches that had cemeteries that had racial deeds attached to those cemeteries, that the black bodies wouldn't be buried in these cemeteries, or they wouldn't be, or if they were buried in the cemetery, they would be in their own place. So we think segregation's in the South. Well, even up into the 1950s and 1960s, our own Brethren in Christ cemeteries were segregated. I'm not sure people in those congregations today know that, unless they've read my article and done a little research on that. But we're embedded in this history as local churches as well.
Yeah. I know one of the, you're talking about the history of race in your county and stuff like that. There's where I am in Chester County, Pennsylvania. I live in Downingtown. Our church is in Exton, but we draw from all the areas surrounding Lionville and Malvern, and Coatesville is one of the places where we draw a lot from. And Coatesville was the site of I think it was the last lynching in Pennsylvania. Zechariah Walker in I looked it up here. Was it 1911? Yeah. Our own backyard. We have that's a part of our legacy in our county, is that we were the site of the last public lynching in Pennsylvania, and it's just like, oh my gosh, like that's part of our history here. Trying to come to terms with that, and seeing where that took place and everything like that, we still see a lot of racial segregation. Now, not necessarily government mandated segregation, as it were, but
Right.
just it is, and very divided areas of our county and in our state. So it's
And it's complicated, and I don't
yeah,
want to say that when we begin to talk about race and remedies is anything simple, but these segregated areas, in the North, residential segregation was part of government policies for a long time, and now that's continued. It's kind of trickled down to class issues where, because of that history, there's a different disparity in wealth, and if you're trying to move out of that area, you just don't have the money to do that. So, but what long was kind of embedded in racial policy has trickled down into class realities today. So even when people are, eager to or would like to move to an area that's not segregated anymore, the means to do that aren't available to them.
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
Yes. Yeah, it's complicated, which is why some of those more simplistic solutions are so attractive. I think, going back to one of our earlier questions, it doesn't require as much of us in a lot of ways. Well, man, my gosh, Dave, thank you so much for your time today. Scott, do you have any other follow-up questions here?
I really don't. That was a lot, and I appreciate learning from you, Dave, and all your work, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, we are. Dave mentioned here for our listeners here. Dave mentioned a little bit ago the Theological Study Forum, and the Brethren in Christ does these periodically. These things called theological study forums, and they've been done. Now, I've only been with the denomination for a little while, a little over a year, and so the only ones that I've done have been via Zoom. I don't know if they were in person in other ways, other times, but this one that he's referring to is going to be Thursday, February 23rd. So this episode is coming out early February. So if you're listening to this and you still are interested, you want to get in on this Theological Study Forum, it's on February 23rd from 10 to 12:30 via Zoom. Now, I don't have a link for that Zoom yet, but if you're interested in attending that, please reach out to us, biclifepodcast@gmail.com. Again, biclifepodcast@gmail.com, and we will get you any of the information that you need as we get it as well. I'm going to be attending that. I'm really looking forward to it. It's called the BIC and Civil Rights, What We Can Learn from the Past for the Challenges of the Future. And Dr. David Weaver-Zercher will be the presenter for that Theological Study Forum. So again, check us out, biclifepodcast@gmail.com if you're interested, and we'll get back to you with any information on how to attend that. So really looking forward to that. Thank you for making yourself available for that as well. Also, if anyone's interested in reaching out to you, have questions, they've read these articles. Let's say they've read these articles, which again, we highly recommend and are called. The first one, Sympathy and Disfavor, The Brethren in Christ Church and Civil Rights from 1950 to 1965. And the second one, let me get here, is called Words Empty and Hollow, The Brethren in Christ Church and the Challenge of Race, 1967 to 1975. So those are the two articles. Really encourage you to check them out. But let's say they've read these articles and they have some questions for you. How can they reach out to you?
Yeah, probably the easiest way is just to email me at my Messiah University address. So it's dzercher, dzercher, @messiah.edu. And yeah, I'd love to hear from people, either questions people have or their own comments on what I've said, or maybe they have some other stories to share or that they know from BIC history. Anything would be great.
Oh, man, that's so cool. All right, well, hey, again, Dave, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all for joining us here today on the BIC Life Podcast. We're going to, if you have any questions about this or concerns or anything, again, you can reach out to us at that Gmail address, biclifepodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and to learn from you. Like Dave was saying, if there's any stories you have or anything like that, we'd love to hear them. So Thanks for checking us out today, everybody, and we'll catch you on our next episode. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the BIC Life Podcast. Brethren in Christ churches exist to follow Jesus, serve others, and make disciples. If you're looking for more information about the BIC denomination, or if you're looking for one of our local churches, head over to bicus.org. And if you'd like to get in touch with us at the podcast, you can do so by emailing us at biclifepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.